Okay, welcome everybody to Presque Isle Audubon's January programming. Our speaker this evening is Erie Reed Miller. Erin is the Senior Coordinator of Bird-Friendly Communities for Audubon Mid-Atlantic Baltimore program, which is part of National Audubon. Erin grew up in Southeast Pennsylvania, so she is a native of Pennsylvania, but she then went along to Delaware where she earned a BS in wildlife conservation and an MS in wildlife ecology, uh, where she worked with Doug Tallamy, Dr. Doug Tallamy. We were just talking about it before the program started. And for Meadville folks, Doug Tallamy is an alum of Allegheny College, and he was our commencement speaker a couple of years ago. Um, and since then, she has served as an interpretive naturalist and environmental educator in Delaware, Oregon, Pennsylvania, and Maryland. Erin has been at Audubon since 2011 as an educator, educator manager, and now bird-friendly communities coordinator, where she works with communities to thoughtfully increase bird-friendly habitat while meeting those communities' varied goals. In 2016, Erin was named the Tamar Chotzen Audubon Educator of the Year, which is a very prestigious award. And with that, Erin, I turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. Good evening, everybody. We had an unseasonably warm day here in Baltimore, and I imagine maybe some of you experienced that as well. So hopefully it doesn't throw our birds off too much. Maybe we'll see a few early blooms, but it's actually a really great time to be thinking about habitat gardening for birds because everything is kind of asleep and we can do all of our best planning and get excited for spring when it actually comes for real. So I really appreciate the introduction and the invitation. As Brian mentioned, I am with Baltimore's program of Audubon Mid-Atlantic, which is part of National Audubon Society. Also a Baltimore City Master Gardener. I always like to toot my own horn there. And also, if there are any other Master Gardeners in the group, I just consider that a really exciting community to be a part of. So we are going to talk for about an hour about habitat gardening for birds. And I was mentioning just before we began tonight that I actually do a 2-hour workshop on this and another 2-hour kind of more advanced version of this workshop. And so the fact that I've kind of consolidated everything into about 45 minutes means that there's a lot of information crammed in. And so I welcome all of your questions and I welcome you to connect with me afterward. And, you know, if we get through early, then I can sort of dive into some of the things that I had to cut out. So before we get started, I know that where you all are quite a ways from Baltimore, but I did want to mention, because I'm very excited, that we just completed a new strategic planning process here in Baltimore. And we're really thrilled to be able to share that and get to work on it with our colleagues across the Mid-Atlantic and across the Flyway. So I'm just going to spend one slide telling you a little bit about that before we dive in. Hopefully I'll give us a little bit of an outlook on where we're going. So we in an urban area, and likely in a lot of the places where you might be joining from as well, we do this work in a really collaborative, people-centered way, because let's face it, birds don't just stay in one spot. They would be so much easier to protect and conserve if they would, but they are hemispheric by nature. And so we have to work really closely with partners and with neighbors like you to achieve the shared goals of protecting birds in the places they live today and tomorrow. So that means that for the past 20 plus years in Baltimore, we have been really good at kind of taking advantage of opportunities to leverage all of our relationships with varied communities and neighbors in order to work on a really hyper-local scale, you know, installing one little patch of habitat in one park, but also be able to scale up that impact across the region and the Flyway and the hemisphere. So I mentioned that this work is hemispheric, and that's because, of course, birds are hemispheric. So about 70% of North American bird species are migratory, and that means that they just spend a very small amount of time here in our region. And so while we're doing our work to protect them here in the Mid-Atlantic, we're also working across the network to make sure that the places that they need are protected across the globe. So we do this in several different ways. In Baltimore, we place high value on creating and sustaining publicly accessible bird habitat. So we think of these as both people-friendly and bird-friendly places, and places where we're thinking about the connectivity for birds, but we're also thinking about the connectivity to the people in the communities where we are building that habitat. We also have a really strong policy agenda focused on natural infrastructure investments as climate solutions. So we know we have to tackle climate change. It's the #1 threat for birds. And so we're doing that through installing, habitat and using plants as a carbon sink. Also with our policy agenda. And then, of course, we're engaging Baltimore communities in those actions of actually building habitat and also advocacy to improve our city for birds and for people. So that's a whole lot of like strategic plannery, maybe very high level. But really when we zoom in on this is kind of my view when I look out of my office, maybe a little bit higher. My office is on the 2nd story. But this is our view, and this is actually a great kind of bird's eye view as they're flying over Baltimore. So at the end of the day, really what we're striving for is the same thing that we all want: a cleaner, greener, more vibrant, more beautiful home that's full of life. So that's what we are hoping to achieve in Baltimore. What that means for all of you is that, I know we come to gardening, landscaping, whatever we want to call it, for a lot of different purposes. Some of us enjoy gardening for growing whole foods, or just being outside and getting some exercise and fresh air. Or maybe we just want our outdoor spaces to be beautiful and that makes us happy. And all of those reasons for the tinkering, the gardening, whatever it is that we're doing out there, those are all great. But the really important thing to keep in mind is that the choices that we make in that gardening, that landscaping, the plants we choose and how we arrange them has those really hemispheric consequences because of the birds that connect our spaces to all the others across the flyway. So I've been talking about these, hemispheric travelers, and I wanted to think about just one of those in this bird on the left. And this is an Audubon group. I feel like I could kind of challenge you. Does anybody know what this bird is? You want to come off of mute and shout it out?
I don't know if it's a wood thrush or a hermit thrush.
It's a wood thrush. Yeah, excellent. So I really love using the wood thrush as an example because it's maybe not one of our flashier, bird species, like, our orioles or things like that. But a wood thrush is a neotropical migratory bird species, which means that it is just as comfortable among the toucans and the howler monkeys in Costa Rica as it is here in our eastern forests. So it spends its winters in Central America, and then it makes this incredible migratory journey, stopping and nesting here in the Mid-Atlantic region. I really love this fact about wood thrushes. They weigh about 40 grams, which is the same as about 15 pennies, if you can imagine holding 15 pennies in your hand. And yet the wood thrush will actually fly across the Gulf of Mexico in a single night along its migratory journey. So really, really powerful, if diminutive, beautiful little bird. So I use this image on the right. This is a NASA satellite image to highlight what birds are a lot of times seeing as they're migrating, because about 80% of migratory bird species actually migrate at night. And so they're using the stars and the moon and the Earth's magnetism to be able to navigate and orient and be able to find their way. And so at night, they are actually lured towards our cities and our towns by the bright lights that we have. And this obviously leads to a problem. They're not able to orient themselves because of the light pollution. They end up flying into our cities and towns. That's why we have an incredible amount of bird diversity, even in really densely urban areas. And so these birds find themselves here because of our lights. They might circle or try to find necessary habitat until they are completely exhausted and have to land. So we might not think about our urban spaces and our suburban spaces as being migratory bird hotspots, or as a need for creating migratory stopover habitat in those spaces. But because of this issue with our lights, and because of the fact that most migratory birds are traveling at night, it's actually really critically important that we create patches of habitat and hopefully some connectivity among them to help our birds. So I don't like to dwell too much on these next couple of slides, because I know that we're all here to make a positive difference, but just to be able to highlight the issue here. So for a lot of birds, this is where their story unfortunately ends. Our poor wood thrush population has declined by about 2% each year recently, and their population as a whole has declined by about half over the last 50 years. And the same is true, unfortunately, for about 40% of all neotropical migratory songbird species. So these images are as a result of a 2019 study that found that overall North American bird populations have dropped about 30%, for a total of about 3 billion fewer birds now than there were in 1970. A lot of those birds, as you can see in the image on the right, are migratory bird species. So there's lots of reasons for that. We already mentioned climate change is the biggest one, but of course habitat loss and declines in insect populations. Lots of threats from everything from cats and window collisions to pesticides. My guess is that we've already heard a lot of this before, and so let's make sure that we get quickly to what we can do about it. So truly there is a lot that we can all do, both individually and collectively. Sometimes we think, oh, I might just have a very small space. What kind of difference can I make? Well, first, you never know where that exhausted wood thrush is going to land. And second, each of us is an ambassador for our neighbors. I looked up a quick statistic and found that about 84% of the land in Pennsylvania is privately owned. And so that means that we have a lot of decision-making power and influence over how we choose to kind of share those spaces with birds and other wildlife. So at the most basic level, I bet even Brian's 9-year-old daughter knows that for habitat, we need food, water, shelter, and space. And so we're going to break those down just a little bit. I'm going to spend the most time talking about food and how we provide the 4 bird food groups by way of native plants. I always get lots of questions in these talks about feeders, and so I will just very quickly say that feeders are a really great way for us to be able to interact with birds, and they can certainly supplement birds' diets in the winter. But really, we want to talk more about how we provide a bird feeder through our landscapes. Birds need clean water with an emphasis on clean. We're all hygiene experts at this point, right? So we know that when there are lots and lots of individuals congregating in one place, it's a really great opportunity for diseases and parasites and things like that to spread. So we want to make sure that we have a clean water source for birds to be able to bathe and cool off and maintain their feathers. Shelter and nesting sites, we're going to get those through dense layered plantings. And then, easy peasy, all of those things combined, we have a habitat. And now comes the really important part of spreading the word to all of our neighbors and friends and coworkers and whoever else will listen, or maybe some people who won't listen. So how do we get all of the things that birds need to eat in our landscape? And this is a question of like birds' life cycles. It's also a question of what's available at different times of year. So I used to teach actually elementary school kids about habitats and everything to do with birds. And if I asked any of them, what do birds eat? They'd say birdseed or worms, or maybe bread that I throw them in the park, or those kinds of things. And sure, birds do eat those things, but they really have a few more food requirements throughout the year and throughout their life cycle. So I want to go through each of these. We're going to start with nectar. Really great for us to be able to provide nectar producing plants in our landscape, both because they feed and attract our pollinators, including our single native hummingbird species, which is a ruby-throated hummingbird. But the other really great reason for planting nectar producing plants is because flowers are really pretty. And so this is where we get to be really creative in our landscapes by incorporating all of our favorite colors and fragrances, and making sure that there's something blooming as long as possible. So these overlapping sequences of bloom throughout the year. So our hummingbirds are certainly going to come and eat nectar from our flowers, especially if they are kind of long and tubular shaped. But another really important part of birds' diet, many birds' diet, is seeds. And we as humans have maybe heard that seeds and nuts are a superfood, right? Because they have all these healthy fats and they're full of nutrients and minerals. Well, the same is true for birds, and eating seeds make sure that those nutrients and minerals last a long time in their bodies. And this is really, when it comes to providing seeds in our landscape, it's sure about planting plants that produce seeds, but it's also about maintaining these plants in a way that considers birds' needs over the course of the year. So I would encourage us to maintain our seed heads long past when flowers are blooming, through the winter, even into the late winter, early spring. Our resident birds are going to keep coming and eating off of those seed heads. Those native flowers and plants are going to be able to reseed themselves, which is great. And those dried herbaceous stems standing over the winter are going to be able to harbor overwintering insects that we really want to be able to emerge again in the spring. All right, so we have our nectar, we have our seeds. Our next food group are berries. Berries are my first example of how plants are really smart. Plants obviously can't, reproduce and disperse the way that animals do. And so they have evolved to perfectly time the ripening of their berries, their seeds inside this fatty, sweet treat, to coincide with when lots and lots and lots of animals are burning tons of calories. So the fact that our native berry producing plants ripen and get super delicious in the fall when birds are migrating is no coincidence. It works out really well for the plants and it works out really well for the birds. So we want to make sure that we have native berry producing plants that are really high in fat in order to fuel birds' fall migration. And then I've saved this food group for last, but it is certainly not the least. The biggest and most important food group that most birds have is insects. So 96% of our terrestrial bird species, so that's our land-living bird species, eat insects at some point in their life. And that's because insects are packed with protein. Some insects are up to 75% protein by dry weight. If you all experienced the cicada emergence that happened last year, I'm sure you witnessed lots of animals eating lots of cicadas, and that's because cicadas are basically flying protein shakes. They're so high in protein. When it comes to insects, the most important insects that we can provide in our landscapes are actually caterpillars. So caterpillars are first really soft and squishy and easily slide down baby birds' throats. Not to get too graphic, but that's just a fact. And caterpillars also have twice as many of these things called carotenoids as other insects. So without getting too sciencey about that, it's really essential for boosting birds' health. It's what makes their feathers really colorful. And we might know that birds a lot of times require really colorful feathers in order to show off to potential mates. And so if you leave here with anything tonight, I hope it is that native plants equals caterpillars equals sexy birds. That's really what we're going for. So to get insects and caterpillars in particular, we need native plants. And it's not to say that non-native plants are bad. They still provide a lot of the same ecological services as native plants. They still produce oxygen, of course. They clean our air, they soak up and filter water, they provide shade, all of those things. But the really critical thing that non-native plants do not do for us is supporting our food chain. And that's because most of our food chains start with an insect, and insects are really picky eaters. So this is our second example of how plants are really smart. They might want their berries to get eaten and their seeds dispersed, but they don't particularly like their leaves getting eaten. And so they've evolved all of these toxic chemicals inside their stems and leaves in order to be unpalatable to insects and other herbivores. And therefore, it has taken a really long time for an insect to be able to co-evolve with a plant and adapt the ability to digest the chemicals in that plant. Unfortunately, as an animal is using all of its energy to adapt the ability to digest the chemicals in one plant, it's losing the ability to digest chemicals in other plants, which leads to specialization. And I have an image up here of a very famous specialist insect that a lot of people know about. And so I will invite you again, if you want to, go off mute and shout out what kind of insect this is, if anybody knows. Anybody?
A monarch?
It's a monarch, yes. So it's going to turn into a beautiful monarch butterfly. And so my follow-up question is, what kind of plants do monarch caterpillars need to eat?
Milkweed.
That's right. Yes, milkweed. So yes, excellent job. Okay. So like monarch caterpillars, about 90% actually of herbivorous insects can only eat one type of plant. So they've co-evolved with a certain plant. That's the plant that they can eat. And so when we plant a milkweed or any other native plant, we are in effect restoring this ancient food web between plants and the insects with which they co-evolved. So that is really why native plants are so important. So I have a side-by-side comparison here of two different berry-producing plants. The one on the left is a very popular ornamental berry-producing plant. I am not here to judge or throw shade on anybody who has this plant in their landscape. It's very beautiful. I don't blame you. This is Nandina domestica, or heavenly bamboo. And it supports exactly 0 species of caterpillars. I think the horticulture industry likes to call that pest-free. So not great for our local food webs as compared to a local vaccinium, which is our native blueberries and cranberries, which as a genus support almost 300 different species of caterpillars. So, this is a You know, I chose this side-by-side comparison for a reason. But if we can just kind of imagine the complexity of the food webs that are able to come out from a blueberry plant, that's what we're hoping to achieve. Lots and lots of insects for our birds to eat, and the berries are pretty great as well. So that's kind of all the theory behind this. And I know that it's a lot of background information, but I did say that you all are ambassadors. And so you need to have this information so that when your neighbors are like, why does your yard look so wild? You can launch into a diatribe about insects co-evolving with native plants. So let's get to how to do this. I hear a lot of times that native landscaping is the absence of landscaping, right? Just let it go. But I would argue that barren lawn is actually the absence of landscaping. And native landscaping takes some time and some effort and some really careful planning. So I like to start with some big picture goals and guidelines. These are just kind of things to keep in the back of your mind, things to plan toward. They're not necessarily things that you are going to achieve after one weekend at your local native plant nursery, but hopefully things to guide you. So my first guideline is to make it a goal to reduce the amount of lawn or paved surface. I say paved surface because some folks don't have a lawn, but instead a paved patio. But to reduce that amount of lawn or paved surface by half. And we do that by thinking about our outdoor spaces the same way we think of our indoor spaces, as a collection of rooms with activity areas, and then those rooms are connected by pathways, as opposed to a big, open lawn. And I can hear you like, oh my gosh, it would be so much work and so much money if I was to landscape my entire yard. And that's why I said this is a long-term goal and guideline. So that's my first goal, is we are going to think about our outdoor activity areas and connect those activity areas by pathways and fill in all the other spaces in between with plants. So I will get into our layers of plants and how we do that in just a bit. So that is our second long-term goal. Our second guideline is to plant densely in masses and in layers everywhere that's not in our outdoor rooms or on places that are difficult to mow. So if you have a steep slope or an area that never seems to drain of water, those are great places to put some plants. So we are essentially creating the outdoor rooms walls with layers of plants. We are using ground cover plants to create the floors of our outdoor rooms. We're forming ceilings of our outdoor rooms with the arching limbs of trees. Those layers of plants are really, really important. And that is because different layers of vegetation are occupied by different species of birds and other wildlife as well. So the number of layers of vegetation that we have opens up different niches for species to be able to occupy, which is really how we're going to get as much biodiversity in our landscape as possible. I really like this image. Hopefully it's not too blurry for you because it shows how, if we have an overstory, a canopy layer in our landscape, that's the only way we're ever going to see things like hawks and flycatchers. These are species that like to sit up on a perch and be able to, scan for their prey. So they need that canopy layer. Alternatively, we are not going to see a whole lot of thrushes or sparrows or towhees or wrens. Those are birds that like to hop around on the ground and, forage in the leaf litter. So we need that ground cover layer if we're ever going to hope to support those species. And then in between, in our shrub and our understory layers, where we have all of our woodpeckers and our nuthatches, those species that like to use kind of the trunks of the trees. All of our hummingbirds, again, are going to be hopping amongst our flowers of our shrubs and our understory trees. So as many layers as we are able to fit is how much biodiversity we can support. And even if we don't have huge yards, I mean, I obviously, most of the time I'm working in a very densely urban area. And so I like to point out that these layers can be mimicked in container plantings as well. So even in a very small space, we have woody plants here surrounded by some dense plantings of either grasses or sedges or ferns. They're kind of filling in the spaces. And then even, you know, falling over the sides of our containers. We have things blooming and sort of getting at that vegetative height diversity. So we are imagining our outdoor rooms. We're filling in the spaces with plants. And then my last guideline for you is to avoid the plant zoo. So that means that hopefully we're not going plant shopping and getting one of this and one of this and one of this. As tempting as that is, and I can speak from personal experience, I know that that is so tempting, but really what will make foraging so much more efficient for our birds and our insects is if our plants are planted in clusters or masses instead of specimens. So if you imagine an individual insect, you know, your little bumblebee is hopping from one bloom to the next, it's going to be much more efficient for it to travel between the same bloom that's very close together in a cluster than sort of wasting a lot of time traveling longer distances between blooms. So landscapers will call this massing or drifting. It's actually a really great thing for our animals that are foraging for seeds or nectar or insects or whatever the case may be. So this image is a really small example. Again, it's actually a circular planting in the middle of like a roundabout cul-de-sac type thing. So we still have there's really only room for herbaceous plants here. We don't have a shrubland or anything, any space like that, but we have, you know, our masses of blazing star, goldenrod, our coneflowers, our black-eyed Susans. So everything is planted really densely. There are lots of things in bloom. We've essentially planted a plant community. So this idea of designing a plant community, you can read about more in a really great book I would highly recommend called Planting in a Post-Wild World by Thomas Rayner and Claudia West. And this book really expertly describes how each layer has both an ecological function as well as a design function. So hopefully we're making our gardens look beautiful at the same time as we're supporting all of this biodiversity. I also wanted to throw out another resource that I would recommend, The Living Landscape by Rick Dark and Deb Tallamy. And it's, I mean, just beautiful photographs, beautiful enough to be a coffee table book, but I think also really wonderfully shows in real photographs how these different layers of plantings can look in a real landscape. The other great thing about that book is the appendix in the back lists all of these native species, so they're listed by region, and has different icons for each plant's ecological function as well as design function. So for example, it has beautiful fall foliage, that's a design function, and it produces nuts, that's an ecological function. So this is another example of this kind of density of layers of plants that I'm talking about. And when we plant in this way with all of the spaces filled in, we're actually really helping the microclimate of this planting at the same time. So this sort of traditional way of planting plants with big gaps in between them and separated by mulch creates a really harsh growing environment for those plants because the sun can reach the ground, it's evaporating all of the soil moisture. If we're able to fill in those gaps between the taller species with these kind of tough ground covering plants, such as the Pennsylvania sedge in this picture, we are significantly improving the microclimate of that entire planting. So we've created better growing conditions for the more demanding species by allowing the surface temperature of the soil to stay low and moisture to remain accessible in the soil. And we're also filling in all of those holes, those gaps that are otherwise going to be filled by nature, meaning weeds planting themselves in all of those spaces. So we're really trying to fill in that entire ground niche. It's going to benefit the birds and the animals that want to use that ground cover layer as shelter. And it's also improving the entire planting. And we can see why that is if we look at a cross-section of the roots of these plants. So when you plant Blazing Star liatris, you might not realize that its roots will actually grow up to 10 feet down into the soil and several feet out to each side. So of course, if you're buying this plant at the nursery and you're looking at its tag, it'll say to space this plant 12 to 15 inches apart. And that, you know, that makes sense. If you had this plant planted right next to itself, then it would be, its roots would be competing with each other. But that doesn't mean that we can't plant something smaller right next to it. So what we should really be doing is planting more shallow-rooted ground cover plants in between these deeper tap-rooted grasses and perennials. So they're not competing for the same water and nutrients. And we're creating this dense multi-layered planting. So let's dive into the layers a little bit. I'm looking at my time, and so we're going to kind of rush through these a little bit. But I want to highlight kind of the design and the ecological importance of each of these layers. When we're planning our landscapes with these layers, we're going to start from the top down. We're going to plan from the top down, and that's because as plants get closer to the ground, they're going to be impacted by the plants that are taller than them because they're being shaded by them and such. So our structural layer, when we think about designing our landscapes by creating outdoor rooms, this structural layer, these plants are really the studs of the walls of our outdoor rooms. So these are the tallest plants, and you can sort of imagine them sort of forming just like the studs in your walls. They're forming like the studs of the walls of your outdoor rooms. So of course, this includes things like our trees and even shrubs, but also some of our tall perennial plants like Joe Pye weed, I think is what's illustrated here, switchgrass, things like that. As we get closer to the ground, we next get to what the authors call the seasonal theme layer. And these are probably the plants that most people think about when they think of native plants. So, you know, your blooming beautiful things, right? Your coneflowers and etc. This layer is much more diverse than other layers. There are just more species of herbaceous plants than there are of woody plants. So it can feel a little overwhelming because there's lots of choice in color and texture and form and fragrance and all of those things. And so to kind of help you out, what I like to do when I'm kind of planning a new space, first of all, I start very small because the microclimate here is not the same as the microclimate over there. And I definitely want to choose the right plant for the right spot. I try to think of maximum 3 plants that can fit in that spot. And 3 because I want one that blooms in the spring, one that blooms in the summer, and one that blooms in the fall. And so if I can sort of plan for an overlapping sequence of bloom and a continual source of nectar and seeds, then it helps me sort of narrow down my choices. After the seasonal theme layer, we get closer to the ground and we get to the oft forgotten and completely ignored ground cover layer. But this is really the most important layer because it's the most functional. So this ground cover layer is what's responsible for our stormwater management and erosion control and weed control. It's essentially green mulch. Everywhere where you would have put mulch in the past, now you're going to plant a ground cover plant. So a lot of times these plants are shade tolerant, even though they might be planted in a sunny spot, because they are going to get shaded by the taller plants around them, they often emerge from the soil earlier in the spring when the soil is still cool and the days are shorter. And then as the ground warms up, they get shaded out by taller species. So these are things like, I think I mentioned like sedges and grasses, ferns, if you're thinking of a shadier spot. Our native sedums are really cool. Creeping phlox, all of those kind of like ground covering, not necessarily super short. Some of them can get, 12, 18 inches tall or taller. But these are basically the plants that are filling in between our seasonally blooming plants. And then, okay, so nature refuses to be categorized, right? So of course there are exceptions, these weirdo plants that we call fillers. And these are species that don't really fit nicely into any of the layers. They're kind of opportunistic. They sort of fill in where other species have failed, or there's a disturbance. Maybe you overweeded in one spot. And so you plant something like a cardinal flower or a columbine, and the next year you're like, what the heck, where's that columbine that I planted? Oh, it's not here where I planted it, it's over there. So these are great species to have in your landscape if you can, because they're able to kind of over time, improve your native seed bank and be able to fill in instead of a weed filling in where there's an empty space. So I really wanted to highlight that this is doable at all scales. Again, it's going to take like some patience and some planning. Even if you have a very small space, I mean, just look how many plants and layers are packed in here, and I don't see any mulch, and that's what we want. Whoopsies. I realize that this type of planting to the casual observer might look a little unkempt. And so I admit and I recognize and I concede that this type of planting really may require a shift in mindset. We're used to maybe thinking about individual plants that we curate and control, where really we should be thinking of groups of species that interact with each other and interact with the site. And if it helps to kind of translate this otherwise messy type of planting to your neighbors, we can talk about something really important called cues to care. So this is the last main point that I'm going to make. I see that we're at 7:45. So cues to care is a phrasing that comes from a paper called Messy Ecosystems, Orderly Frames. So of course, messy ecosystems are very messy. You don't walk into a prairie and think like, what a mess. But when we're putting a prairie in our front yard, people might have a little bit of an issue with that, or you might even have municipality ordinances that have an issue with that. And so cues to care are how we frame these spaces to hopefully make them a little more approachable, palatable to our neighbors. And, hopefully this is, the landscaping of the future. We just need enough ambassadors to kind of get the word out there and also serve on HOA boards. So our first cue to care up here in the top left is demonstrating a mowed or a mulched edge. So you might have, a prairie type landscape planted in your front yard. If you mow the edge or mulch the edge, it's going to show that that planting is purposeful and it is being maintained. So I chose the two images on the left on purpose because they're from the same property. So the image on the top is from the front yard. You can even see their neighbor's house right across the street. And so they have this very deliberately mulched edge. The image on the bottom is from the same property, but it's from the backyard. And it's a lot of the same species, but she's not so concerned about cues to care back here because it's in the backyard. Next cue to care, this image I'm demonstrating how we should limb up our trees and prune down our shrubs in our front yards to allow a line of sight to our windows and doors. If we have trees and shrubs, branches, and leaves growing all in the way of our windows and doors, it looks like perhaps we're dead inside our homes. We don't never want to convey that message. So kind of careful pruning to allow that line of sight is another way of showing that this is a purposeful planting, even though there's lots of layers of plantings here and there's no mowed grass to be seen. Any type of structure, so raised beds, fences, any kind of terracing or containers, all of those are going to show pretty obviously that this is a purposeful space. So, you know, we have our mowed space over here, and then we have this, you know, structural divide, and then we have our native planting here. And then these images along the right from top to bottom are showing overlapping seasons of visual interest in our garden. So making sure that there's something blooming from, you know, early spring to summer to fall, maybe some overwintering berries, some really interesting bark, some really cool like branching or something that's like a visual interest in all seasons is a way of showing that this is a designed plant community, not just a forgotten mess. Both are, you know, equally beneficial to birds. The birds don't care either way. So I have just a couple slides to show how this can look in a few different settings. Front yards, backyards, side yards. I really don't like that phrase backyard habitat because it implies that this type of planting is only for the backyards where it can't be seen. But you saw the, you know, the wood thrush population. It was, we need our front yards too. So we can do it. No yard, no problem. Patios, full shade, full sun, little of this, little of that, doesn't matter. If you can fit a plant in it, stick a plant in it. Raised patios, decks, balconies, spilling out into the alleyway. You can tell that I do this presentation a lot for urban dwellers. Tree pits, window boxes, that little space between the sidewalk and the street. All of these spaces add up. So we are really shooting for this collective conservation movement. I love this image on the bottom left of her native habitat garden on her houseboat in the Baltimore Harbor. So collectively, we all can, you know, all these spaces add up. We're hopefully all talking to our neighbors. We're convincing each other. We're sharing seeds. We're doing plant swaps. We're not swapping invasive plants. We're swapping native plants. And then individually, we never know where that wood thrush is going to land. So each of our individual spaces can make a big difference as well. I wanted to let you all know where there are some more resources on our website so that, you know, if we were in person, I would have brought all of these colorful handouts, but sadly we're not. So if you go to patterson.audubon.org under the conservation tab and click this plants for birds, go to that page and scroll to the bottom. There are all these downloadable resources. I really like our list of top 10s. These are the top 10 native plant genera for trees, shrubs, and herbaceous plants, as well as seasonal maintenance guides, and National Audubon Society's Native Plants database is right there as well. So you can put in your zip code, search, and get a list of plants that are native to your area, which you can then filter by the types of birds you're hoping to attract. So lots of ways to get involved. If you're involved in a chapter, then you're already volunteering and donating, and that is fantastic. Hopefully you are motivating your neighbors, using your voice to vote for birds and communities. And with that, we're at 7:51. I'll say thank you, and I'm eager to hear your questions.
Thank you very much, Erin. That was a really wonderful presentation. So we do have some time set aside for questions. So if you want to type your question into the chat, either Sue or myself, we will read these questions to Erin. And also, before we get started with Q&A, I should have mentioned this at the beginning. But we have a survey that we ask folks that comes to our programming before you leave. If you could click on the Google form that I just dropped into the chat and offer your thoughts about this evening's programs, ideas for future programs. We just would love to hear from you. But with that, let's turn it over to some questions for Erin. So let's see. Frida writes, I have silverweed and I am really bad at these.
Let's see if I
Okay.
can read it.
Yeah, I'm gonna let you read this, Sue.
Oh, okay. Yeah, she has silverweed in Serena, Argentina as a spreading ground cover. It's an uncommon plant native to PA. And I'll just put in a word for Freda here. She is one of the appointees to Erie's new Environmental Advisory Council, and she's an avid gardener. I know she tries to use a lot of native plants, and that's why she's piping in here with the definition of the city of Erie weeds. And I think that's very helpful that you put that in there. And I like that point you made, Erin, too. If you confine those plants in one way or another, people realize it's purposeful and it's not just that you're ignoring what's going on in your front or your backyard, and you're less likely to have a problem with the city, I would imagine. So another question is, what is the best way to handle leaves? Raking, mulching, disposal? My maple leaves tend to clump up.
Oh, did you say leaves or weeds?
Leaves.
Oh,
From the tree.
leaves.
Leaves.
Oh, I mean, leaves are nature's mulch. That's just free mulch. Yeah, I like to think about maintenance in the way that like Mother Nature is doing maintenance. So in the fall, leaves are dropping. That's the time that nature is mulching. In the spring, everything is thawing, all of those leaves are decomposing. That's the time when nature is fertilizing. And so, like, by all means, hopefully you are able to kind of push some of those leaves into your beds. I certainly know people who have more leaves than they have places for them or know what to do with them, and they pile up to, like, my grandmother's yard. Actually, the leaves get like, they go on down into this gully and then they get like up to your waist. And so that's not great either. So my hope and with my Audubon cap on is that we can preserve as much of the leaf litter in our yards as possible, because that is a lot of times where our insects, all these insects that we're trying to feed with our native plants, are overwintering or pupating. So when we clear out all of those leaves, we might plant an oak tree and it feeds all of these caterpillars and it's so fantastic. But then we clear all the leaves out from underneath it, or we mow underneath it, or heaven forbid, we put down landscape fabric underneath it. And so we're essentially kind of like cutting off the life cycle of all of those caterpillars that we are feeding with our oak tree, because they are, if they're not getting eaten by birds, they're dropping down at some point and they're trying to find somewhere to pupate. And a lot of times it's in the leaf litter or in the ground covers or in the ground itself that's right underneath that tree. So my advice, if you have leaves, is to try to keep as many on site as possible. If you have to move them, to put them into planted beds or to put them around your trees. And if you have to get rid of them, offer them up to your neighbors so that hopefully they don't go to like the burn pile or the wood chipper or the landfill.
Yeah. Freda, I have a question for you, Freda. Does the city of Erie still collect leaves and then churn them into mulch that people can help themselves to in the following year?
What you can get is whatever they're calling compost. So that's a combination of whatever people are putting in their compost trash that gets composted. So it isn't just leaves. So you don't really know what it's not. If it was just leaves, it might not be a problem. But if it's somebody's lawn clippings and they spray, etc., do you really want that in your garden?
Yeah, I didn't realize that. I thought it was strictly leaves.
Nope.
Okay. We do have a question from Chris. He wonders, was the shrub with the berries and waxwings in the title photo an arrowwood, Viburnum dentatum?
Yes, excellent identification skills.
I have a question. I didn't bother typing it in. And I was wondering, is there any type of plants I could put in front of my parents' graves instead of the usual geraniums?
That's such a great question. I've never gotten that question before. I think it might, I mean, my first task would be to make sure I know what the rules are of the cemetery in terms of what kinds of things you're allowed to plant. And then, yeah, I'd be trying to think of, nothing that grows more than, 6 inches tall, right? Something that stays very low growing. And then I'm going to start inspecting the soil and the amount of sunlight it gets. And each of these things are, it's really tricky when I get questions about what plant should I plant in this spot, because there are so many different factors that go into what plant is going to thrive there. And what I really try to encourage people to do is, like, when it comes to designing or planning your garden, your landscape, your flower beds, 80% of your time is going to be doing research on the type of plants that will thrive there. So if you know how many hours of sunlight it gets, if you know the moisture level of the soil, which a lot of times plants are going to be categorized as either wet, like there's always standing water there, moist, so it like never fully dries out, or dry. And dry can mean that like sometimes it gets wet, but it's going to drain pretty quickly. Each of these are filters that you can a lot of times type into native plant databases and be able to kind of filter in addition to height of the plant. I'm going to put my favorite one in the chat, even though I know I did just put the Audubon native plants database, but this is actually my favorite one, is the Ladybird Johnson Wildflower Center native plant database. You can filter now, unfortunately, as far as like native, you can only filter by state. But after that, you can filter by what type of plant, if you're talking about like a tree versus shrub versus grasses, vines. And then you can filter by hours of sunlight, moisture level of the soil, bloom time, bloom color, height. So that is where I would go.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Mhm.
Before I give you another question, I wonder if, because I know several of the people attending are gardeners, I wonder if you could either unmute yourself and tell us where you like to buy native plants, or type it into the chat. And this would be Erie and Crawford County, because I would like a resource like that for myself. So if you could do that, that would be great. And then I'm going to ask a question in the meantime. Or here's a comment. There's a new green burial section of Greendale Cemetery in Meadville, Crawford County. It's restricted to native plantings, but we haven't worked out much beyond that. Well, that's a good idea,
That's
though.
great.
Yeah.
I have never, that's fantastic. And I actually just read a paper recently about how city parks and cemeteries are these really amazing hubs for birds. And
Yes.
particularly for cavity nesters. And it was really highlighting the importance of keeping our old trees, even if they're snags, or even if they're like half dying, if they're not, I mean, it's in a park, so it's not going to fall on someone's house or car or the street. If it's in an open area, to try to keep those snags for cavity nesters, and they're really, really important.
Somebody's wondering about what could they replace English ivy on a slope beside the street with?
Yeah, so this is kind of a question of scale. My hope is that there's enough space to still try to plant several layers. So instead of replacing it with just one plant, I would try to think about what is the tallest layer of plant that can fit in that spot. If it's, right below a power line or something, then maybe we don't want really tall trees. But think about what is the tallest layer that can be planted there. and then, you know, work your way down and try to fill in as many of those vegetation layers as possible. More like woody plants are going to be better because they're going to hold onto the slope or hold onto the soil and prevent erosion. If you were asking about it like just an English ivy replacement period, my first go-to is always Virginia creeper. And it's not, you know, one for one. It's deciduous. It's not evergreen like English ivy is, but it does get beautiful red fall foliage. It is quite aggressive, but a lot of times when we're replacing something that's aggressive, we have to replace it with something that's equally aggressive. And so you're potentially setting yourself up for having to maintain that plant instead, but at least it's a native plant and it feeds all of those native sphinx moths that Virginia creeper plants. So that would be my best one-to-one replacement. But if I was planting on a sizable enough slope, I would try to fit in as many layers as possible. One of my favorite groups of plants for a slope, and there's several different kind of heights to choose from, are sumacs.
Ah, okay.
And
Someone
there are
mentioned
these like ground, like very low growing sumacs that I've planted on slopes that have done really well.
I guess I'm used to the sumacs that are like 10 feet tall.
Yeah, so there are like the taller ones, like the staghorn sumac, but then there are like aromatic sumac. Rhus aromatica is a lower growing sumac shrub. And there's actually a cultivar called Grow Low that only gets a couple feet tall, but 10 feet wide. So it's a great kind of slope coverer because it's very like far reaching.
Yeah, someone mentioned not to plant something too high because then oncoming cars might not be able to see around the planting too well. And someone mentioned several suggestions about where around here to get native plants. They mentioned Jen Salem's native plant sale. She's located at the Tom Ridge Environmental Center. And that plant sale starts in April and you pick your plants up in June. And I know you can go online and order them from her ahead of time. And when I go to her website, I see that frequently some plants are sold out early. So I would encourage everybody to go there sooner rather than later. And then also, this is Pam. She's mentioning about the Conservation District. They have a plant sale every April. And then Stan's Garden Center and Mason's have a few native plants. They say there's not much of demand for them. I guess that's why they don't care or carry them. So she suggests we go out and create a demand and the native plants will likely come. Okay, another question here.
So even if you don't know to buy a light bulb, just go over to the garden center and ask for native plants. And even if you weren't planning on buying native plants that day, but maybe if enough people ask for them, then they'll start to carry more.
Yeah, you know, that'd be great if Stan's would do that at Mason's because I think they're the two biggest, besides the big box store, they're the two biggest garden centers in this area. And someone else, Barry mentioned Prairie Moon Nursery and Prairie Nursery are online. Pittsburgh has native plant sales and nursery, and there's a new native nursery in Fredonia, New York, which is about an hour from Erie. So we'll keep that in mind. And Freda mentioned when she moved here 12 years ago, she brought her shrubs or got her shrubs mail order from White Oak Native Plants in Seneca. I'm assuming that's Seneca, New York, then by Buffalo. Okay. Great suggestions. Thank you, everybody.
I have a quick question for Erin. This is Miriam.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Well, actually, two questions. One serious and one not so serious. Erin, in the beginning of your presentation, you were talking about creating spaces in Baltimore, and I couldn't help thinking about that Kirtland warbler that landed there, a couple of years ago, right next to a ball field. Was that an intentionally created space, or was it just a random strip of land and the bird just landed there because it couldn't find anything else?
You said it landed right next to like Camden Yards, the baseball field?
No.
Yeah.
No, a baseball field.
It was a ball field, and it was somewhere very close to the harbor, I think.
So there is a native plant garden right next to Camden Yards. It got planted on my birthday several years ago. So I took off work so I could volunteer to go help plant it. And it was actually designed by Claudia West of Planting in a Post-Wild World that I just mentioned. And really great example of massing and ground covers, because it's in an area where there's a lot of people walking. I think they didn't want like some kind of big obstruction type planting. So there's a lot of, I think there are river birches planted there, and then mostly really low growing things. But it's very shaded because it's in between the stadium and the other building that's right there. So it's a lot of woodland phlox and columbines and ferns. So it is a purposefully planted native space, and a perfect example of you just never know where these birds are going to land once they're kind of lured into the city and they're disoriented and exhausted and confused. So all of those little habitats make a difference, even if it's just for one bird.
That's really awesome. My serious question is, as ambassadors, beyond the residential spaces, are there tools for us to, or do you know if any, that we could use to go to, say, companies we work for, or companies in the area, and talk to them and say, hey, you have all this space and all this lawn, and you're not growing anything interesting. How can we, because they usually go for, what did you call it, insect free?
Test free.
Test free, yeah. They
Test
usually go for
free.
test free because it's easy maintenance, but is there any pressure we can exert on them?
So, I mean, my advice would be to kind of consider your spheres of influence and start with your place of work or your kid's school or your, community park. And, volunteer or share some resources. And, maybe there's already a committee set up at one of those places who, that's thinking about environmental issues, and you can kind of broach the topic of native plants. That would be my tact. So, like, personally, I serve on my community association greening committee, and I try to work with our neighborhood elementary school, even though I don't have any kids that go there, and just sort of try to use my own spheres of influence. I think probably like walking up to a business and knocking on their door and saying, hey, why don't you plant some more native plants? Like, you might not get very far.
No.
I mean, another way to influence that is through like policy and regulations. So one thing that we are hoping to do in Baltimore is pass, native plants on state-owned property. So why can't City Hall have, all native plantings around it? That's something that we would hope to achieve through policy. And that really just requires lots of voters advocating for it.
One of the things we have in Erie now is we now have a stormwater utility, and there are different kinds of credits that commercial larger property owners can get for having stormwater management measures. And I mean, I would like to see us having native plantings rather than lawns become something they can use as a measure that they can get credits for. Greg Kidzierski from Ernst Conservation Seed has been working with us. We have a small plot at the Page Street property of the Water Authority in Erie that he's done all the work to plant native kind of a demonstration wildflower garden. So we have kind of a place to start to show people what could be done. And maybe there'll be more like that.
Yeah, demonstration sites with signage are a really, really good idea.
Where is Page Street?
Page Street is near the McConnell Elementary School there on.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's north of 38th. And it's down towards the end of the street, but it's it's a 10-acre property and it's a nice flat piece of ground there and it's not, there, like the water authority had some property up in Glenwood Heights and we thought, nope, this is not the place to start.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and someone else said thumbs ups to Earn Seeds. They are a great resource. Yeah, get stuff from them. Another person commented they went to stands and asked the gentleman there about natives, and was told that they might not grow as quickly or offer as much bloom and satisfaction as a cultivated plant. And they're thinking perhaps we need to adjust our expectations. Or maybe you mean to say they need to adjust what they're expecting. I'm not quite sure. I think people listening tonight would be happy to have less blooms, but to use a native plant instead.
Yeah, I think when you plant annuals, they bloom for a long, long time, but then you need to replant them each year. And I'm not a purist. I don't think that we can't plant annuals. I actually think that if you have a really new planting and there's still some space in between your plants before they kind of grow and fill out, that popping some annuals in there for some extra color, for some extra pollen and nectar is fine. They can't be invasive because they're going to die at the end of the season. We do have to be a little bit careful with that because of climate change. There are species of annuals that are starting to overwinter as our winters get warmer. A good example of that is lantana, really popular annual species. But yeah, I mean, perennials are not the same as annuals, but I would argue that if you do the research and know that you're planting a plant in the site conditions that it is, adapted to grow in, then you will get as much satisfaction out of it as an annual. I'm not sure what they meant by like a more cultivated plant. Like a native plant is still a cultivated plant because you're choosing it and planting it. So keep asking for the natives.
Let's see. Thank you, Erin, Prescott Audubon. Well done. And I agree. I'm going to make sure that I put a notice on our Facebook and Instagram pages about people who missed it can access it on our YouTube site because this is a lot of helpful information here. Pam notes that there's a native plant project here in Erie that's offering a workshop for landscapers this March to encourage the use of native plants to replace invasives. That is great. It's sponsored by PAC grant and participation by the Master Watershed and Master Gardeners. Wow, that's great. Pam, do you know how people could sign up for that, or where, if you knew a landscaper, how you could direct them towards this workshop?
Yeah, I do have the information. It is there. Oh, I think I can copy the, the registration stops, February 5th. Let me see if I can put this in the chat. There, that's the website where they can sign up.
Wonderful. Thank you.
That's great. Are there any final questions for Erin before we let her go? I do have my 9-year-old daughter's question. What are some native plants to attract hummingbirds in
I wanted to
Northeast
mention,
Pennsylvania? Yes.
so all of those nectar producing plants and the ones with the tubular flowers. So my favorite is our one native honeysuckle is coral honeysuckle, Lonicera sempervirens. You need a nice sunny spot for it. But the other thing I want to make sure Olive knows is that hummingbirds eat a lot of insects too, and they feed insects to their babies. And there are these really cool YouTube videos that she can look up that show how hummingbirds open their mouth really, really wide and then like fly and catch an insect in their mouth. And they film these in these like super slow-mo cameras. So Lonicera sempervirens and any native plant that attracts a lot of insects.
Cool. Awesome. Thank you. Okay.
One of the other, I'll say one of the other resources that's on our website is called Plant This, Not That. And if you have like a very common ornamental plant that you're thinking, what should I plant or what should I recommend to somebody to plant instead of this very popular but non-native or invasive ornamental plant, that's the document to look for. So there's only kind of a handful of species, but so the first one is like butterfly bush. Don't plant butterfly bush. Instead, plant Joe Pye weed or sweet pepper bush. So it's a native alternatives to common non-native ornamental plants. That's a
If I
good
could-
one to look at.
If I could just sneak one more thing in, I missed the very beginning, but I didn't hear the Homegrown National Park mentioned. And it's a map. There's more than just that, but there is a map of the United States. And I was actually the first garden in Erie County on the map. And so
Wow.
anybody, you don't have to be super, you don't have to have a super duper garden, but go to the Homegrown National Park page. And if you're doing native gardening, put yourself on the map.
Yeah, and that's a Doug Tallamy project, so we just came full circle.
That's great. That's great. Well, Erin, thank you so much. This has really been a wonderfully informative program. I know for myself, I'm going to go back and watch the YouTube of this in a couple of days and try to pull out a few different things. So thank you so very much. And I want to remind all of our folks on the call right now is that our next program is going to be on Friday, February 16th at the same time, 7 p.m. And it'll be our very own Mary Birdsong that will be giving a recap of 2023 plover season out at Gull Point. So that is what we have to look forward to next month. So thank you all very much. Again, thank you very much to Erin. Really do appreciate your time, and we wish you all a good evening. So thank you very much.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye. And I'm going to stop recording now.